Dr. Sarah Chen pressed her face against the cold metal of her cell wall, listening to the strange humming that echoed through the alien vessel. 3 days had passed since the Catherian ship had captured her research team during their routine survey of the Outer Rim colonies. Her colleagues had been taken elsewhere, leaving her alone with nothing but questions and the bitter taste of recycled air. The door to her cell slid open with a soft hiss, revealing a figure that made her breath catch in her throat. The Catherian stood nearly 8 feet tall, its elongated limbs moving with an unsettling grace. Its skin appeared to shift between deep purple and black, like oil on water, and where its face should have been, there was only a smooth surface with 3 glowing nodes arranged in a triangle. Human designation Sarah Chen, the creature spoke, though its voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. You will accompany me to the examination chamber. Sarah had heard stories about Catherian examinations. The few survivors who had escaped their ship spoke of mental probing, of aliens who could reach into minds and extract thoughts like pulling fruit from a tree. She had always assumed the stories were exaggerated, born from trauma and fear. Now, walking down the organic-looking corridors of the ship, she wasn't so sure. The examination chamber was unlike anything in human technology. The walls pulsed with a faint bioluminescence, and in the center stood what could only be described as a throne made of crystalline structures that seemed to grow from the floor itself. Surrounding it were dozens of smaller beings, each one connected to the central structure by thin, glowing tendrils. Sit, commanded the tall Catherian, gesturing toward a simple metal chair facing the throne. Sarah reluctantly took her seat, her heart pounding so hard she was certain the aliens could hear it. The tall being moved to the throne and settled into it with fluid motion. The moment it made contact, the entire chamber came alive. The walls brightened, the smaller beings began to emit a low, harmonious tone, and Sarah felt something pressing at the edges of her consciousness. Do not resist, human. Your cooperation will make the process less unpleasant. But Sarah Chen wasn't just any human. She was a neurobiologist who had spent the last 15 years studying consciousness and the human brain. More importantly, she had been one of the lead researchers on Project Mindbridge, a classified program designed to create mental defenses against potential alien interference. The techniques were theoretical, untested on living subjects, but she had memorized every protocol. As the alien presence pushed deeper into her mind, Sarah began to implement the first defense layer. She visualized her consciousness as a vast library with countless rooms, each containing different aspects of her memories and personality. Instead of fighting the intrusion directly, she began to guide it, leading the alien presence away from her most sensitive thoughts and toward carefully prepared mental constructs. The Catherian's confidence was evident in the casual way it rifled through what it believed to be her surface thoughts. It found memories of her childhood, her education, her fear of spiders, her love of classical music, standard human experiences that fit perfectly with their existing understanding of the species. But these weren't real memories at all. They were elaborate fabrications she had created during her training, designed to satisfy a probing intelligence while protecting her true self. As the alien delved deeper, Sarah felt its surprise. Human minds weren't supposed to be this organized, this controlled. Most species they encountered had chaotic thought patterns, memories scattered like leaves in the wind. But Sarah's mind was different. It was structured, architectural in its precision. The Catherian pushed harder, trying to break through what it perceived as unusual mental barriers. This was where Sarah's real expertise came into play. Instead of building walls, she had learned to create mirrors. Every probe was reflected back. Every attempt to force entry was redirected into loops that led nowhere. The alien's frustration was palpable now. It increased the intensity of its mental assault, pouring more of its consciousness into the connection. This was exactly what Sarah had hoped for. The deeper the alien went, the more of itself it exposed to her counter techniques. Working carefully, she began to map the structure of the Catherian's mind. It was vast, ancient, filled with the accumulated knowledge of thousands of years, but it was also rigid, set in patterns that had remained unchanged for millennia. The alien had never encountered a mind that could actively resist and adapt in real time. Sarah discovered something incredible as she explored the edges of the Catherian's consciousness. Their entire species shared a collective mental network, each individual connected to every other through quantum-entangled neural pathways. They weren't just probing her mind, they were sharing the experience with their entire race. This realization brought both terror and opportunity. If she made a mistake, if the alien discovered her deception, the knowledge would be instantly transmitted to every Catherian in existence. But if she could turn the tables, if she could find a way to exploit their connection, the alien was becoming more aggressive now, its mental presence feeling less controlled and more desperate. Sarah could sense its confusion and growing anger. Nothing in its vast experience had prepared it for a human mind that could not only resist but actively deceive. She decided it was time to spring her trap. Carefully, she allowed the alien to believe it had broken through her defenses. She presented it with what appeared to be her deepest, most guarded secret: the location of Earth's hidden military installations and the details of humanity's most advanced weapons. The Catherian seized upon this information eagerly, its mental presence surging forward to claim what it believed was the prize it had been seeking. But the moment it fully committed to absorbing this false intelligence, Sarah struck back. Using techniques that pushed the boundaries of human neural capacity, she reversed the flow of the connection. Instead of being probed, she became the prober. The shock to the Catherian system was immediate and devastating. For the first time in its 1,000-year existence, the alien found itself on the receiving end of a mental invasion. But worse than that, through its connection to the collective consciousness, Sarah's assault was being transmitted to every member of its species. The chamber erupted in chaos as the smaller beings began to convulse, their connection to the central figure becoming a conduit for Sarah's counterattack. The tall Catherian tried to break the connection, but Sarah held firm, her years of training and her understanding of neural pathways giving her an unexpected advantage. As the alien's mental defenses crumbled, Sarah began to understand the true scope of what she was dealing with. The Catherians weren't just conquerors, they were collectors. For millions of years they had traveled the galaxy, absorbing the consciousness and knowledge of every species they encountered. Earth was just their latest target. But now, for the first time, they had encountered something that could fight back. The mental feedback loop Sarah had created was tearing through the Catherian collective consciousness like wildfire. What had started as a simple human interrogation had become an unprecedented crisis for a species that had dominated the galaxy for eons. Through her connection to the alien's mind, she could feel thousands of Catherian vessels across space suddenly losing coordination as their pilots struggled with the unfamiliar sensation of mental chaos. The tall Catherian in the throne began to convulse, its smooth face flickering with patterns of distress. The smaller beings connected to the central chamber started disconnecting themselves, their survival instincts overriding their programmed loyalty. But it was too late. Sarah had already downloaded vast amounts of information from the collective network, and what she discovered changed everything. The Catherians had encountered over 3 million intelligent species in their long history. Each one had fallen to their mental probing techniques within hours of first contact. Civilizations that had taken millions of years to evolve were stripped of their knowledge and consciousness in a matter of days. The aliens didn't just conquer, they absorbed entire cultures into their collective memory, leaving behind empty worlds filled with mindless shells of former beings. But humans were different in ways the Catherians had never imagined possible. Unlike every other species they had encountered, human consciousness wasn't a unified stream. It was chaotic, contradictory, capable of holding multiple conflicting ideas simultaneously. Where other beings thought in linear patterns, humans thought in spirals, tangents, and impossible loops that defied conventional neural architecture. Sarah pressed her advantage, using the alien's own connection against it. She began flooding the network with uniquely human concepts that the Catherian collective mind couldn't process. She transmitted the feeling of listening to music while doing mathematics, the sensation of being homesick for a place you've never been, the complex emotion of loving someone you also find incredibly annoying. The effect was immediate and devastating. Across the galaxy, Catherian ships began losing power as their pilots struggled to process concepts that had no equivalent in their ordered, logical thought patterns. The idea of deliberately believing something you know isn't true. The human capacity for self-deception and hope in the face of impossible odds. The strange comfort humans find in controlled fear through horror movies and roller coasters. All of it crashed through the alien network, like a virus they had no immunity against. Back in the examination chamber, the tall Cytherian was fighting to regain control. It tried to sever the connection, but Sarah had learned to navigate their neural pathways better than they could navigate hers. Every time it attempted to withdraw, she followed, pushing deeper into territories of consciousness the aliens had never explored. What are you? The Cytherian finally managed to vocalize, its voice now carrying tones of fear and confusion that seemed impossible coming from such an advanced being. I'm human, Sarah replied, maintaining the mental connection while speaking aloud. And you made a very big mistake. Through the link, she could feel the alien's growing terror as it began to understand the true implications of what was happening. The Cytherian collective had always operated on the principle of absolute mental unity. Every member shared the same base thoughts, the same logical processes, the same understanding of reality. It was this unity that made them so powerful, but it was also their greatest weakness. Sarah began introducing the concept of individuality into their network. She showed them what it was like to disagree with yourself, to change your mind, to hold personal secrets that nobody else knew. For beings who had shared every thought for millions of years, the idea of mental privacy was more alien than anything they had encountered in their galactic conquests. The psychological impact was catastrophic. Across space, Cytherians began experiencing something they had no word for: loneliness. For the first time in their existence, they were becoming aware of themselves as separate entities, and the sensation was driving them to madness. But Sarah wasn't finished. She had discovered something in the depths of the alien's memory that filled her with cold determination. The Cytherians hadn't just been studying humanity for potential conquest. They had been planning something called the final convergence, a process that would strip every human on Earth of their individuality and absorb them into the collective consciousness. The process was already underway. Cytherian infiltrators had been placed in key positions across human space, slowly introducing neural modification technologies that would make the eventual absorption easier. Millions of humans already carried dormant Cytherian implants waiting for activation. This knowledge triggered something primal in Sarah's mind. The protective instincts that had driven human evolution, the fierce loyalty to tribe and species that had carried them from caves to stars, all of it focused into a singular purpose. She stopped playing defense and went on the attack. Using everything she had learned about Cytherian neural architecture, Sarah began systematically dismantling their collective consciousness from within. She introduced contradictions, paradoxes, and impossibilities that their logical minds couldn't reconcile. She showed them the beauty of imperfection, the strength found in weakness, the wisdom of admitting ignorance. The tall Cytherian in the throne was now writhing in what could only be described as agony. Its connection to the collective was becoming a source of pain rather than power, as Sarah's mental assault spread through the network like a plague. But the alien was learning too, adapting in ways its species never had before. "Stop," it pleaded, and for the first time, Sarah heard something she recognized as genuine emotion in its voice. "You're destroying us." "You were going to destroy us first," Sarah replied without sympathy. "The difference is we can survive as individuals." "Can you?" The answer was becoming clear. Across the galaxy, Cytherian vessels were going dark as their crews succumbed to the psychological chaos Sarah had introduced. Some were adapting, learning to function as individuals, but the process was traumatic and many didn't survive it. The alien made one last desperate attempt to break free, pouring all its remaining mental energy into severing the connection. But Sarah had become something unprecedented in galactic history, a human who understood alien consciousness better than the aliens understood themselves. As the connection finally began to weaken, Sarah realized she had a choice to make. She could continue her assault and potentially destroy the entire Cytherian species, or she could show them something that might be even more terrifying to beings who valued logic above all else. She could show them mercy. The concept hit the aliens' consciousness like a physical blow. Mercy was illogical, inefficient, strategically unsound. Yet humans practiced it regularly, even toward enemies who had wronged them. The alien's mind reeled as it tried to process this final contradiction. Sarah felt the mental connection snap as the Cytherian finally managed to withdraw, but the damage was done. Throughout the ship, alarms were sounding as systems failed and crew members struggled with their newfound individuality. She had turned their greatest strength into their greatest weakness. But as she sat in the examination chamber, surrounded by the chaos she had created, Sarah realized the real battle was just beginning. The Cytherian ship shuddered around Sarah as secondary explosions echoed through its corridors. Emergency lighting cast eerie shadows across the examination chamber where she remained seated, watching the tall alien struggle to maintain its composure. The creature that had once projected absolute confidence now moved with jerky, uncertain gestures as it fought to process its first experience of individual thought. "You don't understand what you have done," the Cytherian said, its voice now carrying inflections that suggested genuine panic. "Our species has maintained perfect unity for over 4 million years. We have brought order to a chaotic galaxy, absorbed the knowledge of countless civilizations, created harmony from discord, and you have introduced madness." Sarah stood up slowly, testing her freedom of movement. None of the restraining fields were active anymore, and the smaller beings that had once monitored her every action were now huddled in corners, overwhelmed by their sudden awareness of self. "I've introduced individuality," she corrected. "What you call madness, we call being human." Through the mental link that still flickered between them, Sarah could sense the true scope of the chaos she had unleashed. Cytherian fleets across 3 sectors of space were reporting system failures as their crews grappled with concepts they had never needed to understand. Ships that had operated with perfect coordination for millennia were now struggling to maintain basic formation as each pilot began making slightly different decisions. But something else was happening too. As the collective consciousness fragmented, individual Cytherians were beginning to experience things their species had forgotten how to feel. Wonder, curiosity, fear, joy. The emotions were crude and overwhelming, like a person born blind suddenly gaining sight. "Where are my colleagues?" Sarah demanded, though she already suspected the answer. The tall Cytherian's head turned toward her with movements that seemed more natural somehow, less mechanical. They are being held in the absorption chambers. The process was scheduled to begin within the next cycle." Sarah felt her blood chill. She had read about absorption chambers in the fragments of memory she had stolen from the collective. They were where the Cytherians converted captured beings into empty vessels, stripping away everything that made them individuals, while preserving their knowledge and skills. "Take me to them," she ordered. The alien actually hesitated, another unprecedented behavior for its species. I cannot. The ship's commander would not permit it." "Your ship's commander is probably curled up in a corner somewhere trying to figure out what it means to be alone," Sarah pointed out. "Face it, your chain of command just collapsed along with your collective consciousness." The truth of her words was evident in the way the alien's form sagged. For the first time in its existence, it was making decisions without the input and approval of thousands of other minds. The weight of individual responsibility was crushing. Sarah pressed her advantage. "You want to understand what you're feeling right now? That confusion, that uncertainty, that fear? It's called being alive. Really alive, not just part of some cosmic hive mind. And if you help me save my people, I'll teach you how to handle it." The offer clearly intrigued the alien, though it struggled to understand why. In the old system, such curiosity would have been shared instantly with the collective and analyzed by thousands of minds working in perfect harmony. Now, it was his. Curiosity alone, and the novelty was both terrifying and exhilarating. "The absorption chambers are 3 levels below," the Cytherian finally said. "But the path is guarded by automated systems that will not recognize my individual authority." "Then we'll find another way," Sarah replied, her mind already working on the problem. During her mental assault on the collective, she had absorbed considerable information about Cytherian ship design and security protocols. More importantly, she had learned something about their technology that gave her an idea. "Your ship's systems are partially organic, aren't they? They respond to collective thought patterns." The alien nodded. "The ship is grown rather than built. It responds to our unified will." "But now there is no unified will," Sarah said with growing excitement, "which means the ship is probably as confused as its crew." She was right. As they made their way through the corridors, it became apparent that the ship itself was struggling with the breakdown of the collective consciousness. Doors opened at random intervals, Lighting systems flickered between different settings, and the very walls seemed to pulse with uncertainty. The Catherian, who had introduced himself with the unfamiliar concept of a personal identifier as Zeph, led her through passages that seemed to shift and change as they walked. Other crew members they encountered were too overwhelmed by their newfound individuality to pay them any attention. "This is unprecedented," Zeph murmured as they passed a group of smaller Catherians who sat in a circle, apparently fascinated by the novel experience of looking at each other as separate beings rather than extensions of themselves. "Welcome to consciousness," Sarah replied. "It's messy, complicated, and absolutely worth it." They reached the absorption chambers after navigating through what had once been a precisely organized ship, but now resembled something closer to a living maze. The heavy doors that should have been impossible to breach hung open, their control systems apparently as confused as everything else on the vessel. Inside, Sarah found her 3 colleagues suspended in crystalline pods that pulsed with an ominous blue light. Dr. Marcus Webb, her research partner, appeared to be unconscious but alive. Engineer Lisa Park and Communications Officer Chen Rodriguez were in similar states, their bodies preserved, but their minds clearly under assault. "How do we stop the process?" Sarah asked urgently. Zeph approached one of the control interfaces, his elongated fingers moving over symbols that shifted and changed even as he touched them. I don't know. The procedure was always managed by the collective. Individual minds were never intended to operate these systems. But Sarah had an idea born from her understanding of both human and Catherian neurology. What if we don't try to operate the systems? What if we convince them to operate themselves? She approached the nearest pod containing Marcus and placed her hand on its surface. The crystalline material was warm to the touch and seemed to respond to her presence with subtle shifts in color and intensity. "Your ship is partially alive, right? It has its own form of consciousness?" "Yes, but it is primitive, designed only to respond to collective commands." "Then let's give it something it's never experienced before," Sarah said with determination. She closed her eyes and began to project the same mental techniques she had used against the collective, but with a different purpose. Instead of chaos and contradiction, she offered the ship something simpler and more powerful: the concept of choice. The effect was immediate. The absorption pods began to vibrate, their crystalline surfaces crackling with energy as the ship's consciousness grappled with the revolutionary idea that it could decide for itself what to do. For millions of years, it had simply followed orders. Now suddenly, it was being offered the possibility of independent thought. The blue light in the pods began to flicker and fade as the ship chose to release its prisoners rather than continue a process it no longer understood. One by one, the crystalline chambers opened, revealing Sarah's colleagues in various states of consciousness but clearly alive and unharmed. As Marcus opened his eyes and looked around in confusion, Sarah felt a surge of hope. They had survived the first phase of this encounter, but she knew the real challenge was still ahead. Somewhere in space, the main Catherian fleet was dealing with the chaos she had unleashed, and their response would determine the fate of not just her small team, but potentially all of humanity. The question was, would they adapt to their newfound individuality, or would they find a way to restore their collective consciousness and continue their plan to absorb every human mind on Earth? Either way, Sarah realized, the galaxy would never be the same again. Dr. Marcus Webb struggled to sit up in the crystalline chamber, his normally sharp mind clouded by whatever the Catherians had done to him. Lisa Park was already on her feet, though she swayed dangerously, while Chen Rodriguez remained unconscious but breathing steadily. "Sarah?" Marcus's voice was hoarse and confused. "What happened?" "I remember being captured and then nothing." "I'll explain later," Sarah said, helping him out of the pod. "Right now we need to get out of here and warn Earth about what's coming." Zeph watched the reunion with something that might have been fascination. "I am observing emotional responses," he said slowly. "You display concern for these individuals despite the fact that caring for them provides no logical advantage." "That's called friendship," Lisa said, having recovered enough to speak. "And it's exactly the kind of thing your species has been missing." The ship continued to shudder around them, as its consciousness struggled with its newfound ability to make choices. Sarah realized they needed to move quickly before either the vessel's confusion killed them all or other Catherians arrived to restore order. "Zeph, can you get us to the docking bay?" The alien paused, clearly still adjusting to being asked rather than simply having his actions coordinated by the collective. "I believe so. But you must understand, other crew members may not react favorably to your presence. They are experiencing significant psychological distress." That proved to be an understatement. As they made their way through the ship's corridors, they encountered Catherians in various states of mental breakdown. Some sat motionless, apparently overwhelmed by the silence in their heads where the collective voice had once provided constant guidance. Others moved in erratic patterns, their behavior becoming increasingly unpredictable as they grappled with concepts like personal preference and individual decision-making. One group of smaller Catherians had gathered around what appeared to be a decorative crystal formation, staring at it with intense concentration. "What are they doing?" Marcus whispered. "I believe," Zeph said with uncertainty, "they are experiencing aesthetic appreciation. The concept of finding something beautiful without practical purpose is new to us." Sarah found this oddly touching. These beings had conquered half the galaxy, absorbed the knowledge of millions of species, and possessed technology that bordered on magical. But they had never learned to appreciate beauty for its own sake. They reached the docking bay without major incident, though the journey revealed the full extent of the chaos Sarah had unleashed. The ship's systems were functioning erratically. Crew members were displaying behavior that ranged from catatonic to hyperactive, and the very structure of the vessel seemed to be slowly reorganizing itself as its consciousness explored its new freedom. Their small research vessel sat in the docking bay exactly where they had left it, apparently forgotten in the confusion. But as they approached it, Zeph suddenly stopped. "I cannot allow you to leave," he said, though his voice carried uncertainty rather than the absolute authority his species was known for. "Why not?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Because if you return to your people with knowledge of our current weakness, they will undoubtedly attempt to exploit it. Your species has demonstrated remarkable adaptability and aggression throughout your history." Marcus stepped forward. "You're right. If Earth Command learns that your entire fleet is incapacitated by psychological chaos, they'll probably try to launch a preemptive strike." Sarah felt a chill as she realized the implications. Humanity's first instinct when faced with a powerful enemy would indeed be to attack, while they had the advantage. But such an attack would likely trigger a response from whatever Catherian ships remained functional, potentially leading to a war that could devastate both species. "There has to be another way," she said. "Zeph, what's happening to the rest of your fleet?" The alien's form seemed to shimmer as he accessed whatever remained of his connection to the collective. "Approximately 30% of our vessels have lost all functionality. Another 40% are operating at severely reduced capacity. The remaining 30% are attempting to re-establish collective unity through forced neural synchronization." "Forced synchronization?" Lisa asked. "They are trying to recreate the collective consciousness by overwhelming individual thought patterns," Zeph explained. "It is painful. Many do not survive the process." Sarah felt a wave of guilt. Her actions had been necessary to save humanity, but they were causing suffering on a scale she had never imagined. Millions of beings across the galaxy were experiencing the trauma of sudden individuality, and many were dying in desperate attempts to return to their previous state. "Is there a way to help them adapt instead of forcing them back into the collective?" she asked. Zeph stared at her with what might have been amazement. "You would help us? After what we intended to do to your species?" "Individual responsibility works both ways," Sarah replied. "If I'm going to take credit for giving you consciousness, I should also take responsibility for helping you deal with it." Marcus grabbed her arm. "Sarah, we need to warn Earth. Every minute we delay gives the functional Catherian ships more time to organize a response. And if we leave without helping them, we might trigger a war that destroys both our species," Sarah countered. "Besides, I think there might be a better solution." She turned back to Zeph. "Your species has been absorbing the knowledge and consciousness of other races for millions of years, right? That means somewhere in your collective memory, you have the experiences of billions of individuals who knew how to function as separate beings." Understanding dawned in the alien's posture. "You suggest we access those absorbed memories not to steal knowledge but to learn how to be individuals?" Exactly. Instead of fighting your new consciousness, embrace it. Learn from all those minds you've collected over the millennia. They can teach you what it means to be truly alive. The concept was so revolutionary that Zeph actually staggered. For the first time in Catherian history, the knowledge they had stolen could be used not for conquest but for growth. I must communicate this to the fleet, Zeph said urgently. But the communication systems require collective coordination. Then we'll help you, Sarah said, making a decision that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. Lisa, can you interface our communication array with their systems? Lisa looked at her as if she had lost her mind. You want to connect our ship to an alien vessel that was trying to lobotomize us? I want to prevent a war, Sarah replied firmly. And maybe, just maybe, help create the first truly free Catherian civilization in galactic history. As her team reluctantly began working to establish the connection, Sarah realized they were standing at a crossroads that would determine the future of both species. They could run back to Earth with warnings and weapons, or they could try something that had never been attempted before. In the long history of galactic contact, they could try to build understanding, rather than just fighting for survival. But as alarms began, sounding throughout the ship, and Zeph's form started to glow with urgent patterns, Sarah realized their time for choice might be running out faster than she had hoped. The alarms weren't coming from their ship. Lisa Park had successfully interfaced their communication array with the Catherian systems, but what they were receiving was far from encouraging. Across 3 sectors of space, the remaining functional Catherian fleet was converging on their location with one purpose: to recapture or destroy the humans who had introduced chaos into their perfect order. How long do we have? Sarah asked as Zeph monitored the incoming transmissions. The lead vessels will arrive within 2 of your hours, the alien replied, his newly individual consciousness struggling to process the tactical information without collective support. They are commanded by the hierarchs, the oldest and most powerful of our kind. They have successfully resisted the individuality contamination and maintained collective unity within their vessels. Marcus was running diagnostics on their research ship, his face grim. Our engines are still functional, but there's no way we can outrun a Catherian fleet. They'll overtake us within minutes if we try to run. Chen Rodriguez, now conscious but still weak from his ordeal in the absorption chamber, managed to speak from where he lay on a makeshift stretcher. Sarah, you need to get word back to Earth. Tell them what's coming. Even if we don't make it, maybe they can prepare some kind of defense. But Sarah was thinking beyond mere survival. The solution that had been forming in her mind since the communication link was established was audacious to the point of madness. But it was their only chance of preventing an interspecies war that could last for millennia. Zeph, you said the hierarchs have maintained collective unity on their ships? Yes. They view individual consciousness as a disease and are determined to purge it from our species. What if we showed the entire galaxy that individuality isn't a disease, but an evolution? Before anyone could ask what she meant, Sarah was already moving toward the communication console. Lisa, can you boost our signal strength? I want every Catherian ship within 50 light years to receive this. Sarah, what are you planning? Marcus asked, though there was a note of recognition in his voice. He had worked with her long enough to recognize the signs of one of her breakthrough moments. I'm going to do something that's never been attempted in the history of galactic contact, Sarah replied, her fingers flying over the controls. I'm going to give an entire species therapy. The concept was so unexpected that Zeph actually laughed, a sound that was strange and musical coming from his alien form. You believe you can heal the psychological trauma of millions of beings through a communication broadcast? Not heal exactly, but I can give them the tools to heal themselves. Sarah had realized something during her mental battle with the collective consciousness. The Catherians weren't evil in the way humans understood the concept. They were a species that had become psychologically stagnant, trapped in patterns of thought that had served them well for millions of years but had ultimately limited their growth. They conquered other species not out of malice, but because they literally couldn't conceive of any other way to interact with different forms of consciousness. Need access to the absorbed memories of every species you've encountered, she told Zeph, all of it. Every thought, every dream, every moment of joy and sorrow and wonder that you've stolen over the millennia. The alien's form flickered with uncertainty. That database contains the complete mental patterns of over 3 million species. The information density would overwhelm any individual consciousness. Then it's a good thing I'm not planning to absorb it, Sarah said with a smile that was equal parts determination and madness. I'm planning to give it back. Working with desperate efficiency, Sarah and her team began constructing what could only be described as a consciousness bomb. Using the communication array as a delivery system and the Cytherian ship's organic technology as an amplifier, they prepared to broadcast the complete emotional and psychological experiences of every species the Cytherians had ever encountered. This is insane, Marcus muttered as he helped calibrate the signal generators. You're trying to download the entire history of galactic consciousness and beam it directly into alien minds. The Cytherians have been collecting experiences for millions of years, but they've never actually experienced them, Sarah explained as she worked. They absorbed the knowledge without understanding the emotions, the context, the meaning behind it all. I'm going to give them everything at once. Zeph watched their preparations with growing amazement. You would share the consciousness of 3 million species with beings who intended to destroy your world? I'm sharing it with beings who are capable of becoming something better than destroyers, Sarah corrected. Every species that you absorbed had something unique to offer. Love, creativity, curiosity, hope, the ability to find beauty in chaos and meaning in suffering. You took their knowledge but missed their wisdom. The first Cytherian ships appeared on their sensors, sleek vessels that moved with the perfect coordination of hive-minded crews. Their weapons were charging, their approach vectors calculated with mathematical precision. In minutes, they would be within firing range. Signal ready, Lisa announced. Sarah took a deep breath and activated the broadcast. Across space, every Cytherian ship within range suddenly found itself flooded with something unprecedented. The complete emotional spectrum of galactic consciousness. They experienced the joy of a crystal silicon species that communicated through harmonic resonance, feeling music as a living thing for the first time. They felt the fierce protective love of mammalian parents willing to die for their offspring, an emotion that had no equivalent in their collective consciousness. They experienced the bittersweet beauty of species that lived only briefly, but burned brightly, cramming lifetimes of growth and change into spans that Cytherians would consider mere moments. Most powerfully of all, they experienced hope. Not the logical calculation of probable outcomes that passed for optimism in Cytherian thought, but the irrational, beautiful, absolutely human conviction that things could always get better, that suffering had meaning, that love could triumph over despair. The effect on the approaching fleet was immediate and dramatic. Ships that had been moving in perfect formation began to drift as their crews were overwhelmed by emotions they had never imagined possible. The rigid hierarchical structure that had held their society together for millions of years started to crack as individual Cytherians began to understand what they had been missing. On the lead vessel, the hierarch commanding the fleet found himself experiencing something impossible: doubt. For the first time in his billion-year existence, he began to question whether the collective consciousness was truly the highest form of existence possible. "What have you done?" Zeph whispered, his own consciousness reeling as the broadcast reached their ship. "I've given your species a choice," Sarah replied. "For the first time in your history, every Cytherian can decide for themselves what they want to be." But the broadcast was doing more than just affecting the Cytherians. As the consciousness of 3 million species flowed through space, it began to resonate with something Sarah hadn't expected: the quantum field fluctuations that connected all sentient minds across the galaxy. Suddenly, every intelligent species within 100 light-years was experiencing the broadcast. Humans on distant colonies found themselves momentarily feeling the collective memories of beings they had never imagined. Other alien species that had successfully hidden from the Cytherians suddenly realized they were not alone in the galaxy. Sarah had accidentally created the first galactic communication network based not on technology, but on shared consciousness. And at its center, offering their new understanding to anyone willing to listen, were 4 humans and 1 newly individual Cytherian, standing together in the face of an uncertain but suddenly much more connected universe. The transformation was happening across the galaxy in real time. Sarah watched through the communication link as Cytherian ships throughout 3 sectors began responding to the consciousness broadcast in ways that defied millions of years of conditioning. Some vessels powered down their weapons and simply drifted in space as their crews experienced wonder for the first time. Others began transmitting music, art, and poetry, created by species they had absorbed eons ago but never truly understood. The Hierarch's flagship, which had been leading the charge toward their position, came to a complete stop just outside weapons range. Through the quantum consciousness link she had accidentally created, Sarah could feel the ancient being's mental struggle as it grappled with concepts that had no place in the rigid order of collective thought. Impossible. The Hierarch's voice came through the communication array, carrying undertones that suggested a mind in crisis. We are experiencing individual preference. The sensation is pleasant? Zeph, who had been monitoring his former commander's reactions, turned to Sarah with something approaching awe. The Hierarch is over 2 billion years old. It has never expressed uncertainty or questioned the collective will. What you have done should be impossible. But Sarah was beginning to understand that impossibility was a very human concept. Throughout their broadcast, she had felt the resonant patterns of consciousness from countless species, and one thing had become clear. The universe was far stranger and more wonderful than any single perspective could comprehend. We're receiving transmissions from across the galaxy, Lisa announced, her voice filled with excitement and disbelief. Species I've never heard of are introducing themselves. Civilizations that have been hiding from the Catherians for millions of years are coming out of the shadows. Marcus was monitoring the quantum field fluctuations that had made the galactic broadcast possible. Sarah, I think we've stumbled onto something incredible. The consciousness network isn't just communication. It's creating actual empathic links between species separated by thousands of light years. Chen, now fully recovered and manning the sensor array, added, I'm detecting power signatures from technologies that don't match any known physics. It's like the broadcast has awakened civilizations that were so advanced they had moved beyond our ability to detect them. But perhaps the most remarkable change was happening right in front of them. The Catherian ship around them was literally transforming as its consciousness embraced its newfound freedom. The sterile corridors were sprouting organic decorations that served no functional purpose except beauty. The harsh lighting was being replaced by gentle bioluminescence that created patterns pleasing to newly awakened aesthetic senses. My ship is becoming artistic, Zeph observed with wonder. It is choosing to express itself creatively rather than simply following utilitarian design principles. Through the consciousness link, Sarah could feel similar transformations happening throughout the Catherian fleet. Ships that had been identical expressions of collective efficiency were becoming unique as their organic components began expressing individual preferences. Some were becoming gardens floating through space. Others were restructuring themselves into crystalline palaces that existed purely for the joy of beauty. The Hierarch's voice came through the communication array again, but now it carried tones of curiosity rather than authority. Human designation Sarah Chen, we request. Permission to approach. We wish to understand what has been done to us. The concept of a hierarch requesting permission rather than simply taking what it wanted was so unprecedented that several nearby Catherian ships actually powered down entirely, their crews apparently overcome by the philosophical implications. Permission granted, Sarah replied, though she exchanged glances with her team. They were about to face beings who could still destroy them with a thought, but who were now experiencing consciousness in ways that made them fundamentally unpredictable. The Hierarch's ship approached slowly, its movements no longer displaying the mechanical precision of collective coordination. Instead, it moved with something that could only be described as curiosity, almost as if the vessel itself was eager to meet the beings who had transformed its existence. When the ancient Catherian finally appeared in their docking bay, Sarah was struck by how much it had changed in just a few hours. Where Zeph had been tall and imposing, the Hierarch was enormous, its form suggesting vast age and power. But instead of the cold authority she had expected, it moved with hesitant, almost childlike wonder. We have lived for 2 billion years, the Hierarch said without preamble, but until this moment we have never truly been alive. Marcus stepped forward, his scientific curiosity overcoming his caution. What does it feel like? Going from collective consciousness to individuality after so long? The Hierarch paused, clearly struggling to find words for experiences it had never needed to describe. It is like awakening from a dream of perfect order to discover that chaos is beautiful. We understand now why species fought us rather than accepting absorption. They were not protecting their knowledge. They were protecting their souls. What happens now? Sarah asked. To your species, to the galaxy? To all the civilizations that are suddenly able to communicate? No, the hierarch replied, we learn. For the first time in our existence, we admit that we do not have all the answers. We ask questions rather than simply taking what we believe we need. Zeph approached his former commander with visible nervousness. Will the collective accept this change? Many of our people are still trying to force unity through neural synchronization. The hierarch's form shimmered with what Sarah was beginning to recognize as the Catherian equivalent of a smile. Let them try. They will discover that consciousness, once awakened, cannot be easily suppressed. And for those who adapt, who learn to embrace their individuality, we will share what we have learned from 3 million species about the art of being alive. Over the following hours, as more Catherian ships arrived and joined the growing consciousness network, Sarah began to understand the true scope of what had happened. The galaxy had been fundamentally changed in ways that would take generations to fully comprehend. Species that had never met were forming alliances based on shared emotional experiences, rather than political necessity. Ancient grudges were being set aside as beings experienced their enemies' perspectives through the quantum empathic link. Most remarkably, the Catherians themselves were becoming teachers rather than conquerors. Their vast databases of absorbed knowledge, now filtered through the wisdom of individual experience, were being freely shared with any species that wanted to learn. The irony is beautiful, Marcus observed as they prepared for the journey back to Earth, with news that would reshape human understanding of the galaxy. They spent millions of years trying to create perfect order through conquest. But it was chaos, consciousness, and choice that finally gave them what they had been seeking all along. Sarah nodded, watching through the viewports as Catherian ships danced through space in patterns that served no purpose except joy. Turns out the most human thing we could do was help someone else become more human too. As their ship prepared to jump to hyperspace, carrying news of the galactic transformation back to Earth, Sarah reflected on how a simple act of resistance had become something far greater. She had set out to protect human consciousness from alien invasion, and had instead helped create the first truly conscious civilization the galaxy had ever seen. Behind them, the Catherian fleet spread out across the stars, each ship now unique, each crew learning what it meant to be individuals within a community of choice rather than compulsion. And through the quantum consciousness network that connected them all, the gentle hum of 3 million species sharing their stories echoed across the cosmos, proof that intelligence without wisdom was merely sophisticated ignorance. But consciousness shared freely was the beginning of true civilization. The galaxy would never be the same again. And for the first time in galactic history, that was exactly what everyone involved wanted.